Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the next session of this conference. This panel is called Zionism and the Challenges of Power. I'm Shira Billet. I'm Faculty of Jewish Thought here at the seminary, and I'll be moderating the panel. Zionism and the Challenges of Power is an important and really complex topic, and we're deeply fortunate to be joined by two prominent panelists, Jody Rudorin and Moshe Halbertal, a journalist and a philosopher who bring different sets of expertise and experiences to this topic and will help us address aspects of it. Jody Rudorin became editor-in-chief at The Forward in 2019 after decades of experience in other prominent media outlets such as the New York Times. She brings to this conversation unique expertise in coverage of contemporary American Jews' relationships to Zionism and contemporary American Jews' relationships and their contemporary American Jews' experiences of power and vulnerability. Jody Rudorin has also spent significant time in Jerusalem, serving as Jerusalem bureau chief to the New York Times, and has covered previous wars in Gaza, and can really speak to the ways in which questions and challenges surrounding power have arisen for American audiences in these contexts. Moshe Halbertal, a prominent contemporary Jewish philosopher and legal scholar with appointments both in the Department of Jewish Thought and Philosophy at Hebrew University and at New York University's School of Law, has written from a philosophical and Jewish perspective on many aspects of the moral questions that relate to power and its exercise. He was also deeply involved in developing the IDF's Code of Ethics, which can be understood itself as a reflection on and response to some of the challenges of power for Zionism. As a professor at both Hebrew U and NYU, Halbertal is an observer of both American and Israeli college students and contemporarily and their own experiences and perceptions in relation to the various issues raised on this panel. I offer just a few brief framing thoughts for this conversation before I turn to the panelists with questions. Zionism and the Challenges of Power is an enormous topic, and it can take us in many directions, depending on how we think of each of the terms: Zionism, power, the challenge of. And really, depending on what Zionism is, depending what power is, we could then consider the challenge of power in completely opposite ways. We could see the challenge as a challenge of vulnerability and the need to have more power. We could see it, on the other hand, as a challenge of having power, but not becoming corrupted by that power or not exercising that power in unjust ways. And these are, of course, not mutually exclusive. Everyone wants to avoid being powerless, and that means that we all want to have power. And not just to have power, but to have a durable power, a power that we can have good reason to expect we will continue to have in the future. At the same time, anyone who wants to live a moral life or be part of a moral community wants to avoid exercising power unjustly. So maybe the biggest challenge is how to have enough power to avoid being powerless without also having power that is exercised unjustly. And the question is, can this balance be achieved? Since October 7th, Israel has seemed both profoundly and deeply vulnerable and also powerful, certainly to different groups of people in opposite political camps. But even if we just focus in on the broad group of people who are deeply invested in Israel's well-being, both perceptions of vulnerability and of power have been felt at different times, sometimes at the exact same time. Both perceptions have also been felt in different places, and sometimes in one and the same place over the course of the past year. Our sense of vulnerability and power and the balance look different on October 7th, 2023, than it looks today. It looks different if we focus our frame just on Gaza than if we widen our frame to look at the entire Middle East. It looks different also to different people with different experiences over the past year. It looks different, for example, to survivors of the massacre on October 7th than to some others who had different experiences. It looks different to Gazans than to others. It looks different to hostages than to others. It looks different to the tens of thousands of displaced citizens in the north and south of Israel than it does to others. It looks different to the parents and spouses and children of fallen or gravely wounded IDF soldiers than it does to others. And it looks different to the families of the hostages who remain than it does to others. And so on. We could add many different perspectives. It's very difficult to talk about these things in clear and coherent ways that take account of all of the inherent complexities of all of these questions, especially since the October 7th moment and its aftermath is still so raw, and its impact is still deeply felt and ongoing. Many of us feel at a loss in terms of how to hold these conversations in ways that take account of everything I've mentioned and so much more. The stakes feel really high, and it's impossible to get it right. Still, it shouldn't stop us from holding these important conversations with humility, compassion, and open hearts and minds. And we are therefore deeply fortunate to be joined by these two panelists today who will really help us make sense of different aspects of this topic, even though it's so big and we can only scratch the surface. Just a quick procedural note. Aidan Fisher-Brown, over there, raising his hand and waving, oh, okay, and also Ariel, are carrying around index cards. And throughout the panel discussion between our two panelists, if you have a question that you would like to raise to them at the end, please reach out to one of those folks to get an index card and then to give it, and to write your question down and to give it to them. And we should have time for a robust discussion of the audience's questions at the end. So now I'll begin with the first question to both panelists. And this really addresses an elephant in the room related to the topic of this panel. We're all deeply aware that anti-Semitism is on the rise, both in the United States and around the world. Anti-Semitism often centers on fears of Jewish power and claims, both made explicitly and implicitly, that Jewish power is inherently evil, or that when Jewish power is exercised in problematic ways, that it is uniquely evil. To hold Jews or Israelis to a unique standard with respect to power, a standard different from that of other groups or states, is anti-Semitic. At the same time, as Jews, we often hold ourselves to unique moral standards and expect the highest level of behavior from ourselves as an outgrowth of Jewish beliefs and commitments. So I ask our two panelists, how can we have a responsible and necessary and deeply Jewish conversation about Zionism and power that avoids this anti-Semitic direction that these conversations go? So perhaps we'll begin with Jody Rudorin.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I think we avoid anti-Semitic tropes by avoiding anti-Semitic tropes, and being a bunch of Jews helps us do that, probably. I guess I would challenge a little bit some of the premise there, which is, I think the anti-Semitism around Jewish power is around the idea of Jews exercising power that is beyond their representation or beyond our appropriate, some appropriate level. And this is the sort of like all anti-Semitic tropes and racist tropes. Often there's a root of truth in a stereotype that then gets distorted and abused, and that's how it becomes problematic. So I think that it's all about the scale, right? So the question of talking about, we should, also in your question, it is about when Jews or Israelis are considered anomalously, or I think that's the word, or in some kind of singular way or to some other standard. So we avoid doing that by not doing that, right? So we should address the questions of Jewish power or Israeli power in the context of how we would address the power of another country or another ethnicity or people. Whether, I don't know that we would necessarily, people talk a lot about, do Jews have outsized power in certain industries in the United States? we don't generally talk about other ethnic groups in the same way, although there's some, like people might talk about the power or lack of power, representation of people of color in athletics or in professional sports or in Hollywood or whatever, in hip hop music. So I think, we just check ourselves about being fair and having the proper context around things. I think there's similar danger on the kind of other side, right? Which is we're so worried about stepping into an anti-Semitic trope that we won't talk about Jewish power at all, because we might hit some third rail and play into something that is a stereotype or is an unfair characterization. And I think that's some of what has led to so much discomfort this year. I think, yeah, I'll leave it there. I don't know.
Well,
And Moshe
thanks.
Halbertal.
Well, thanks for having us, and thanks for organizing this discussion. It's really such a deep and important question. Okay. So I have a few thoughts concerning the issue you raised. The first one is really the canopy of anti-Semitism doesn't allow us to think through the problem in a serious way, right? So you say, well, whenever there is something anti-Semitic, it should be exposed, combated, and not allowed. But when you say, well, when you think of criticism as motivated by anti-Semitism, it blocks you from real self-reflection in a serious way, right? Which, for let's say, a citizen of Israel, a Jew, that's a very important thing you do when you exercise power. In a genuine way, you want to know whether you do it properly, how you do it, how it should be done. And you shouldn't be distracted by anti-Semitism. By the way, in the same way, you don't want to be distracted, and that's part of the discourse I hear around where I am while I'm in New York. You shouldn't be distracted by a certain perception of Israel or a certain framing of Israel as an illegitimate entity. Right? You say, well, Israel is a settler colonial state. It's an apartheid state. It's engaging genocide. What you see is actually framing Israel in the worst crimes of Western civilization, and in that respect, preparing the moral ground for its annihilation. I mean, you hear it. And you know how perverse it is, right? How thoroughly perverse it is, both historically and empirically and morally. But that shouldn't block you from seriously engaging with real issues and real concerns, right? You might say, for example, well, Israel is not a settler colonial state because in order to be a colonial entity, you need a state, you need a base, and then form a colony, right? The Jews didn't have a state, didn't form a colony. It wasn't like the Belgians in Congo, or like the French in Algiers, or like the English in India. They were actually massacred in their own base called Europe. And Zionism is a movement of refugees. It's not a colonizing power that actually managed to save around 400,000 Jews prior to Second World War. So there is so much distortion about that. And we have to call it, and we have to speak about it. Here again, the accusation of genocide. I go to Washington Square, that's the epicenter of that call, and I see a young man holding a plaque of genocide. So I asked him, do you know how many Palestinians were in Gaza in 1967? He said, I don't know. I said 350,000. Do you know how many Palestinians are in Gaza now? He said, I don't know. I said 2.3 million. I mean, Israel might do some wrongs, that's fine. But that's not how genocide looks like. Right? Go tell it to the Armenians in Anatolia. Or if you take a a community of that size in Europe, let's say Budapest, had 400,000 Jews. If this is genocide, there should have been now 6 million Jews in Budapest. Now, that doesn't mean, and that has to be called because it's actually, as part of the anti-Semitic trope, it's all about creating conditions of such deep delegitimation that will morally allow the annihilation of Israel. It's actually a perverse coalition with the darkest forces around us in Israel. Now, all that doesn't have to block our capacity to serious discussion of failures and moral failures on our part. And the capacity to actually do those things simultaneously is a really important moral and spiritual challenge, right? And by way of starting that conversation, I want to say something about holding ourselves to higher standards. I don't think we should hold ourselves to higher standards. I'm actually, Jody, I'm in complete agreement with what you said, especially when you talk about war. The moral standards of war, the base moral standard of war, not the exceptional, are such that nations fail in them completely through the 20th century, right? Even the nations who fought the just wars. The Allied bombed Dresden, the Russian forces had massive rape of German women. The US, did actually indiscriminate mass bombing of Tokyo, 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then Vietnam, then the Iraq war. It's very hard to find the justification for the war altogether. What you're saying is the following: you will be exceptional if you actually follow the non-exceptional rules. That's the context in which if we want to be exceptional, we have to say, okay, let's take the base rules of how to apply power and see where we stand with them. And by the way, given behaviors of nations in war, it will be remarkable achievement. And not something you have to celebrate, but remarkable achievement actually to abide by them, because there is something about the history of warfare in the 20th century, clearly before, that is so brutal. By the way, even for those who are so-called fighting the just war. So I would shy away from the language of being exceptional altogether. And the real issue that you raise, it's so important. The question is so deep because it calls us to what's so difficult in these moments is actually to think in complex way and to articulate a complex thought.
So thank you both. So I'm hearing from both of you that this is an issue with complexity and that the kind of worst arguments used against Jews should not stop Jews, nevertheless, from reflecting on what is challenging in terms of power. So that really is a call.
Can I just say one more thing about this anti-Semitism for a sec? I just think it's very rare, at least in our modern society anyway, for a group to be victim and oppressed and stereotyped and harassed, but not systematically discriminated against, and for that group to be holding quite a lot of power in the society, sort of both as individuals and as the group. And I think that we don't have a lot of parallels in the United States for that. We have parallels for sort of oppressed groups who are being both victimized and stereotyped and harassed. I mean, sort of discriminated against, oppressed, and stereotyped and harassed. And that paradigm doesn't really fit what's happening to Jews in the United States now. We sit very comfortably in a lot of institutions and spaces, and we're prosperous and free, and our own history of when we have been oppressed before by anti-Semitism, I think is not a good parallel either, because particularly, I mean, there were obviously people with a lot of power in Europe in the 30s, but they lost it very quickly. And so I think we are struggling to figure out, as you spoke about, like, we are clearly both vulnerable and powerful at the same time. And I think the way in which we interpolate the anti-Semitism around us is really challenged by that. We don't know, and we see around us people putting up all of these defenses and barriers. And I loved your framing of distractions. People are using the vulnerability or the power to block conversations they don't want to have, that are more difficult to have, about what the failings are, or what the mistakes are, what the whatever. And I think it's exactly in that strangeness of being both powerful and vulnerable at the same time that's allowing for that.
Thank you both so much for kind of giving us this voice of complexity of both the real vulnerability and the real challenges around important questions that still need to be thought. And so I wanted to actually pose to you, and you both raised a lot of issues in your responses that we're going to come back to with more specification for each one. For example, what you raised, Moshe Halbertal, regarding a war that is a just war, and also moral failings that can happen in that context. And what you raised, Jody Rudorin, about perceptions of American Jews regarding power and vulnerability. We're going to come back to specific questions about these. But I wanted to just take a step back to ask both of you, when you think of the three terms on this panel, given the complexities that you both just outlined of what makes it hard to talk about this and still what makes it important, so Zionism, power, and the challenge they pose, I wanted to ask what you both think are the most important ways to think about this topic, these terms, this topic, and to ask you particularly from the perspective of your work. So for example, journalism is fast-paced, it's on the ground, it's responsive to the 24-hour news cycle, and it's such a crucial source of information, but also because of the kind of immediacy, there isn't this long view that's always possible on fast-paced reporting. On the flip side, philosophy is slow, takes this longer view, but it's often done at a distance from what's happening on the ground. So I wanted to ask, what do you see as the most important aspects of the panel's topic for our consideration? And then also, what are the advantages and the limits of each of your field's ways of approaching these topics? So maybe we'll begin first with Moshe Halbertal, since we heard first from Jody Rudorin before.
Okay, thanks. Well, that's such a complex and powerful question. So the way I experience the problem of power, or the application of power, right? Let me start with my starting position is there isn't any moral virtue in being powerless, right? Not only that there isn't any moral virtue in being powerless or adopting the luxury of the powerless, especially if you have an American passport and a tenure in an American university. That's always a gesture. Being powerless is actually betraying the people whom depended upon you in a serious way. And also being powerless in the environment we are on, in which we depend on our very existence in asymmetry of power between us and our environment. It's a luxury, it's a moral luxury that is actually rather criminal. So my questions then revolve on the question of application of force, right? Application of power. Now you ask me as a philosopher, so philosophers try to think about issues of just war and how to conduct yourself in war. And being actually both a soldier myself in the past, and family and children and friends, etc. It's very hard for me to talk about it at a distance. It's not a philosophy seminar, you know, it's just not about publishing about just war. It's existential. And you have to, first of all, you have to think through what are the proper principles of people whom you want them to do their mission in ways that will be successful, meaning defending their country and their fellow soldiers, and yet come out of it humans. What are the guiding things? What are the guiding principles you give them? And one challenge, if you ask me about challenges, is that you have to listen very well to the problems they are facing in a serious way. You have to learn from them. When I talk to soldiers or officers, I want to learn from them. I want to know what are the issues you're facing. And also, the main issue is educational. By that I mean, it's not a theoretical, it's what Aristotle calls phronesis, you know, practical wisdom. Or what my father would say in Yiddish, seichel. It's just having seichel, not sechel. He would say there are those people who have sechel, those people who have seichel. By that I mean you can trust their judgment. And I would...
I understand what sechel is, but what's sechel?
Seichel means being aware of complexities in the condition, having judgment, good judgment.
Right.
Not all good philosophers.
That's seichel.
Yeah.
What's the other one?
Okay.
Doesn't matter? Okay, I'll let you go on.
That's a deep problem in analytic philosophy. But I would say the following, and I would say one thing about the nature of the war and the nature of the questions that we all facing in Israel. Let's say, and this is why the challenge is educational in so many ways. If you look at, I don't know, soldiers in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, or in the wars I was part of, the moral challenges of soldiers were minimal. It had to do with prisoners of war, looting. Now, every soldier, even a sergeant, a lieutenant, very low rank, they face complex moral questions of, is this person on the roof a scout, a frightened civilian? Does he have a weapon? Is it a weapon? Is it, I don't know, some other tool? Is he using a cell phone to give information or to actually tell his family to move? All these very complicated questions. And the moral burden is huge. And you need internalization of the moral principles by in some ways, every soldier in the field. And that's, by the way, very difficult to achieve, given that soldiers come from different backgrounds and places, et cetera, et cetera.
And it's not just what they do in the field, but did they take a picture or a video of it, and what do they do with that?
Of course. So I'm sure people in the JTS will understand it, because this institution that is so tied to the relationship between teaching and practicing, right? This is a real issue. It's a real challenge. You have to give them a language that they feel is right to them, a language that they can apply in a serious way. And, you know, writing a philosophical essay about counterfactuals with footnotes. That's not the way to approach the problem. So I have to, actually, for me, you asked me as a philosopher, it's actually a very healthy experience for all philosophers to encounter questions that they have to actually address, human problems. So this is, I mean, this is at large, this is a challenge, but and you talked about long-term, it's really about education. It's education, it's the values that they share. It's the way they see who are their models, because moral education is about modeling. All these issues are, what is actually moral education? And I would say the following. For us being young soldiers at the past, it wasn't much of a question because the real moral problems were answered by 10 people above. Now it's a completely different experience, completely different, and hence the challenges of completely different magnitude. And that's the way I perceive the main challenge, almost insurmountable in certain ways if you think about it seriously. But it's a serious challenge, and for example, one big challenge is to make people who apply force understand that moral limitations are not obstacles to overcoming the enemy. It's almost the other way around. That the ultimate defeat is actually to become like your enemy in some ways. That actually being a mensch is not a reciprocal project, right? That one wrong doesn't justify another wrong. And when you are facing in an atmosphere of failure and vengeance, and when the soul is poisoned, not only the body, that's a serious, serious challenge to work through in a serious way.
I think the limitations of journalism around these questions are really the same as the limitations of journalism around every question. And I guess the challenge, although similar to the ways that the challenge of acting morally in war have devolved, I guess, over the generations. Similarly, the challenges of being a responsible, independent journalist in the digital age and in the age of kind of polarization and demonization have also devolved and gotten harder. So, but I think the core of it, right, is to not be distracted by meaningless noise, by activity, being able to in real time discern kind of meaningless activity from meaningful activity, or noise from actual movement and things that are worth scrutiny, worth explanation, worth platforming. And to provide enough context so that what's new can be understood in its complexity, but not to get so caught up in context that it's all about the context and not what's new. So in a form or a process that's about the first draft of history, the focus is on what's new. How are people changing what they think, how they understand Zionism, or how is the balance of power changing? And those things, I think, do need to be explained and explored in their proper context, but we sometimes get criticism about not enough context, and what people actually want is not news, but history. Because they think that, again, it comes back to a level of distraction, a distraction from what's difficult to look at or hear in your current surroundings could be, well, there's all this history that I feel more comfortable talking about than really confronting what's difficult right now. I'm struck as I was thinking about the question and just sitting here, one of our aphorisms of our profession is that the role of journalism is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And over the weekend, I heard, as it happens, a Christian bishop say that the role of religion is to he used the word unsettle. He said to calm the unsettled, but to also disrupt the comfortable or settled. And we could also replace comfortable or settled with powerful, right? So that the role of, we also talk about journalism's core role as being holding the powerful to account for the ways in which they wield their power. So as Moshe is sort of thinking about, or in some cases guiding those soldiers and their commanders of how will they make moral decisions in real time in the battlefield that has become so much more complicated, it's our role to ask, like, did they do it right? Did they fulfill their own stated goals, their own standards? And to do that even when it is extraordinarily uncomfortable for everybody involved. I think, there's so much in the title of this panel and therefore so much in this question, but there's been this, I think a lot of people probably in this room, in our community, have been sort of really tortured and torn up about the ways in which the word Zionism has been weaponized by extremists on both sides. I think long before October 7th, frankly, but certainly since October 7th, and in a much more present way for many of us since October 7th. And a lot of people are like, but that's not what Zionism means. It means this other thing. They talk about the historical roots of Zionism, and it was a quest. And all of that is true, and the way in which it is being understood and used today in different debates is also important, and the stuff of journalism is to explain that and not be rejectionist of it because we know the context. So it's both to sort of provide enough context, but also understand and follow how things are changing in real time and in different communities and from people from different perspectives. So I think, our limitations are first of all that we are a first draft and not a final draft. But the more, that's a kind of accepted limitation, I think. There's a role for us in that first draft, and then to hand off to the historians and the philosophers. But the newer challenges, right, are the active ways in which some people masquerading as news outlets and as journalism, and others who are not, who are political actors or activists, who are just actively trying to thwart the process of journalism, just thwart, whether it's literally, the IDF not letting international correspondents in to independently view Gaza, whether it's disinformation by, I think there was an article in the Times today talking about Russians, Iran, and China all trying to put out disinformation around our election, or whether it's people who look like journalists and publish things that look like journalism, but it's really advocacy and not looking for new answers, new information, unbiased, 360-degree views of complicated situations. So all of that, I think, I don't know if they're limitations to our profession, but they are certainly very present and potent challenges to our ability to do it right now.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if you have any reaction to that, or just I can go on to my next question.
Sure, go.
Okay, so this is a question now for Moshe Halbertal. Just to tell us more about the IDF Code of Ethics. You were involved in its original formulation, and obviously, as you have already mentioned, there's challenges that have changed over time. So I just wanted to ask, what should American Jews, or what should Americans in general know about the Code of Ethics?
So as Jody said, you always have to think about, is it applied, et cetera, et cetera. But before that, What are then the principles, right? So there, you would say, 4 basic principles of just war theory that should be intuitive. One is, let's call it necessity. When you apply force, you have to apply it only for the purpose of the mission. So if you have to break a wall of a home because there is an enemy there, a terrorist there, that doesn't mean that you can break the TV on the way. That's just what distinguishes a soldier from a thug is necessity. And if you, I don't know, in Lebanon, for example, you don't want to go through the main road because that's where ambushes are waiting, and you have to create a road inside fields. The destruction you do to agriculture will be what's necessary for the movement of forces. You don't say, well, now that I'm destroying all these olive trees, why not? That's the first principle. The second principle is, and by the way, again, this is not replacing judgment, this is helping judgment, because it's in what is exactly necessary is a function of the judgment of the person involved in the operation. But they have to internalize it in a serious way. So that's what distinguishes a thug from a soldier, necessity. Then you have what distinguishes a soldier from a terrorist, which is distinction, meaning your directed force, your aimed force has to be directed towards military targets. You don't directly, intentionally kill non-involved civilians, children, older people, or non-involved civilians. That's, by the way, that's what we resent about terror. It's the way it doesn't have distinction, right? They come in and they kill children, elderly, they kidnap people, etc., etc. They go to this Nova festival. Now, the third one, which is the most complex and difficult, I call it responsibility, is what do you do when targets are embedded within civilian population, right? I talked to a friend and I said, look, I can tell you 70 bases of Israel's military in Israel. It's not a secret. I can show you on the map where they are, etc., etc. Show me one Hezbollah base on the map of Lebanon. And he couldn't, because there isn't a distinct base of Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's thoroughly embedded in the villages, in the places, etc. Needless to say that that's the case with Hamas. So tragically, any attempt to harm or direct yourself to military targets will involve harming civilians. Now, that's very important to remember. The fact that they are embedded there doesn't relieve you of your responsibility for what you would say the predicted outcomes of your actions, though you're not intended, right? But you know they're going to happen. And you are under the obligation to try to minimize them as much as you can. You cannot say, well, they're in bed, it's their problem. No, it's your problem because you're doing the killing. And that means selecting the right time of attack. If that means using the proper accurate ammunition, having the proper intelligence, that means removing the population when it's possible. You are responsible for the harm you might cause. And that's a very, well, you cannot say, given that I'm going to harm civilians, I cannot do anything. That's not a proper way of dealing with it. But again, you say, well, you have to minimize as much as you can the harm, the civilian harm, the cause. And And the fourth principle will be, knowing the amount of harm you're going to cause the civilians, you have to ask, is that harm justified given the importance of the military task you have? It's called proportionality. Now, I gave you on al regel achat, right, in a very short way, what are the kind of leading principles. But one very, so what lies about it is the following. What makes them all one coherent thing, which is very intuitive and important. The only justification for using force is a removal of threat. There's no other justification. It's self-defense. And it has to be restricted to defense. I mean, it could be active and preemptive. It could be imaginative, et cetera, et cetera. And it should be directed towards those who actually pose a threat to you, not to those who not. And when those who not are harmed, you have to try to minimize as much as you can the harm. This is, by the way, I would say something very basic about application of force and the limits of force. I want to say another thing, maybe it's if we talk about force and power. You also have to understand that power is limited by serious moral constraints, but it's also limited strategically. Not everything is achievable through application of power. By the way, the Mishnah says, Ezu gibor, hakoveshet yitzro, right? But there is another version that I love more in Avote Rabbi Natan, in the added Tanaitic material, that says, Ezu gibor, haoseh son'o avu, the one who can turn an enemy into a friend. The last goal of war is peace. And there is a moment we're going to talk, I imagine that will be a question of what are the actual failings or not failings, etc., in this war. But there is a moment in war when you don't have a closure or etc., where the collateral harm you cause becomes a real problem because, if you want to use a technical term, the marginal utility that is gained by attacking the target gets diminished more and more and more and more. So these are issues that you try to teach, and as I say, the real challenge is not teaching it to few military lawyers. That's easy, right? But teaching it and embedding it in a whole army that actually is doing the fighting, including et cetera, in sometimes in places where societal mood is not backing them, and even worse when certain elements in the political elite actually is making political gains by attacking them. So these are the issues. I mean, if you want me to ask me, what is it about? It's about that. It's about, and by the way, it's about your responsibility. I mean, clearly the IDF, Ruach Tzal, the spirit of the IDF, involves other aspects of professionalism and trustfulness and etc. But that aspect of it is, you say, a state has a moral responsibility towards its soldiers. First of all, to protect their lives and not to make them expendable in an unnecessary way, but also to protect their moral fabric as human beings. And since, by the way, it's an army of citizens, whatever moral harm they will be caused to them, it will come back to the society itself. So we are talking about serious, serious matters, grave matters. And then this will be ways of self-examining, if you think seriously, self-examining your failures in applying force and how to correct them, how to struggle with them, et cetera, et cetera. Again, and it's good we started the conversation where you started it, trying to quiet the whole noise around, right? Because you want, on the one hand, rebut serious misconceptions and a very insidious, ugly ways of describing you as a monster, as a moral monster. And yet, and tackle that seriously, and yet look seriously about failings and where they are, et cetera, given those principles you're striving to internalize. And that's a real, I mean, that's a real challenge, a real serious challenge. I'm sure we're going to have some time to discuss in more details, but if you ask me what is a code of ethics or military, more or less it's about that. It's about that. Now it has to be applied in what we call asymmetrical warfare, where the other side is trying to abolish both the idea of a front and the idea of uniform. That's what they're trying to do, right? And that's
Someone wanted you to just repeat that sentence.
well, the other side is trying to basically abolish two features of ordinary war, which is a war has a front or few fronts, and militaries are more or less distinct from their civilian apparatus, and they're fighting one another in Sinai, in the Golan Heights, et cetera, et cetera. That's over. Because the other side, for its own strategic reasons, is trying to abolish that distinction. And applying all that apparatus to that situation, even if you have good intentions, even in conditions of real decency of actors and agents, which I'm not saying exists all over the place, right? It's a very, very complex activity. That's, I don't know, I try to do work on how much? 3 minutes for this very complicated question, but it's...
Thank you. So I wanted to ask if you had any questions or comments on that, and then I have a question for
Well,
you.
I mean, I think what's really important in what you're saying, I just want to kind of pull it out, is so you write this code of ethics, and people do their training on it, and the war cabinet makes a decision to launch an operation, hopefully based on it. And I think, though, what you're telling us and reminding us is it's 1,000 decisions a day, every day, to keep living with the principles and keep figuring the principles out. And I'm just reminded of a couple of other things. I mean, on the issue of proportionality, I mean, I remember well when I was covering the 2014 war and sort of learned about this in detail, and I've been using this as people say, like 40X thousand Palestinians, isn't that too many? And it's like, well, that's not how proportionality works. It's about every individual strike. Was the collateral damage in this strike proportional to the mission in that strike? And that's how the laws of war work when applied, and that's how, you know, the reviews of the incidents are applied. But similarly, as you said, every additional day or additional operation within Gaza or now in Lebanon as well needs to be going back to proportionality and responsibility and distinction and all of that stuff. And I'm reminded just sitting here of like things in our own lives, right? Like if anybody's ever been on a weight loss journey. Like you decide to lose weight and then you have to like decide every single day, I'm going to
Proportionality, yeah.
eat this certain way. Or like we stand up under the chuppah and we make our vows of marriage, and that's not the end of it, right? You have to decide every day to stay in that relationship and make the choices that are about building your life with somebody instead of by yourself. And I think it's like what I think people, there's a million points in the last year when all those principles needed to be applied by all these different people. And I mean, I think you wrote a piece in the New York Times like a few months ago, right, about the ways that but this question of a war can be just because the mission of a war or the declaration of a war is just and is justified and is about self-defense does not mean that every operation is just or justified. And I think that many people are very afraid to engage with that conversation because of the ways that enemies want to say, well, that means the whole thing, the whole project, that we're going to annihilate the whole project. The whole project has no basis in morality. And there's so much gray area between, you know, Israel's a settler colonial enterprise, which is based on a fiction, and everything Israel does in this war is justified. There's all this space, and that's the space certainly where we operate as journalists. I think it's also where philosophers operate, and it's where we all should live, in that messy, complicated, if this, then that space, as opposed to the, you know, we were attacked, we respond.
So just to add to the way you beautifully described the condition, first of all, there are many, many decisions, many decisions engaged. But you have to add two things that are more complicated from that description, which is, first of all, politicians do not support many times this value themselves. When a politician declares there are no innocent people in Gaza, or we're going to starve all of them, he is far, far away from those principles. So part of the obstacle is actually you want leadership to stand behind those principles rather than betray them. And some of our leadership is not there. Now, you also, if you want to add to the complexity of situation, you have a weakening of the authority of the command in general because of their initial failure, and they have to regain. So in order to impose discipline, even if the command, military command is there, it needs authority. And it needs authority, sorry. I'm really sorry.
Very soft-spoken.
I said it needs authority, the command. But after October 7th, some of that authority is challenged. And that's in addition, that's added aspects to the picture you're presenting, right?
I want to draw one other thing out that you said, because you said, you know, the last goal of war is peace.
Right.
And so this whole framework for a just
I stole
war,
it from Augustine, actually.
Okay. But the whole framework for a just war...
I just want to clarify for 1 second that by last goal, you mean the ultimate goal.
There has to be a vision for... So the entire framework that you laid out as a just war, if there is no vision, plan, hope, expectation of, at the end of this, this is how we're gonna get to some peace, it calls into question the whole idea of this framework, right? If that's missing, if there's a missing element of we are doing this so that we get to X.
Well, it doesn't retroactively taint the whole thing, taints the whole thing, because still, you know, you want to downgrade completely the capacity of your enemy to continue. You see, the enemy is a repeat player.
Right.
Right? Describing itself, its commitment for repetition, says, well, we're going to do many October 7th. Right? And their ultimate goal is not peace, right? So you say, well, we have to disable that. Well, what does it mean to disable this complicated idea? But again, closure, some type of closure, is important, essentially important, in the sense of if there is no closure, again, whatever gains you gaining all through are so marginal.
Right.
So you killed another one, etc. And that's fine if it didn't involve collateral harm or pain. In that respect, it wouldn't taint everything you did, because there were some important
But each
things.
step you're doing.
You have to seriously. Now, I'm saying I'm not making things light, because strategically it's very complex to think of closure or when closure has to happen, right? But if you say we are in an ongoing war till total victory, what you're basically saying, I don't see an end to it. And that will create a lot of morally compromising situations, yeah.
All right, thank you both so much. And we're gonna take some questions now from the audience, which I have here on the cards, and we'll get to some more. And we'll see how many questions we can get to. I also myself have some more questions, but there's a lot of interest in this discussion. So I'm gonna read a set of questions, which are for each of you, and we'll start with that. So here's a question that says, that's directed at Moshe Halbertal, statement that moral standards are not an obstacle to defeating the enemy. The risk is becoming like the enemy. And so that's kind of quoting something that you said. And the question is, do you feel this is an argument that can be made in contemporary Israeli society in general, and even more so in the post-October 7th moment? So that's the first question. Is it okay to read 3 questions to take as a
I
together?
can take 3 questions at a time, also, Jody.
Yes, well,
We are
there's
complex
one
people.
for you as well. Okay, so.
As long as it's proportionate.
Another question directed at Moshe Halbertal. How do you think about addressing challenges to the moral exercise of power that arise, kivyachol, as it were, from within Jewish religious tradition? For example, the religious Zionist camp. Okay, so those are 2 questions. And then the question for Jody Rudorin is, you said that there's a kernel of truth in critiques of power and of Israel's power. How do you apply that idea specifically to the charge of genocide that has become part of general academic discussion?
No, you should.
Can you make this argument in the current atmosphere of Israel that
That the moral defeat is worse than anything else?
Yeah, I would say no. I mean, you have to say morality of war should not tie your hand to win the war. Let's start with that. If it does, that's something wrong with your morality. It has to enable you to protect yourself. But if you think, I would say 2 things about that. If you think that what failed you is actually you being moral, your understanding of your failure is very shallow. My experience is many times there is a deep connection between incompetence and brutalization. Okay? It's like a very bad police interrogator who says, the problem of me drawing the information is they don't allow me to torture this guy. No, no, no. You have enough means and enough, something about your intelligence as a competent interrogator is a problem here. That's the first thing. But in a deeper way, you ask yourself, what's then the point of victory if it engages undermining whom you are? What's there the point? Actually, the moral outrage we feel towards the other side, in many ways, has to do with its brutality, with its annihilation fantasies, with its indiscriminate, with its terror, etc., etc. Now, there is a power to the appeal that says, is that what you want to be? Right? Well, you say that there is no innocent people in Gaza. That's what they say about you. Everybody will be a soldier at the end, etc., etc., etc. Everybody pay taxes. The worst thing a country can do, a people can do, is to collectivize the enemy as if it's one subject. It's a horrible thing. There is a place for such an argument, and by the way, I would say there is a majority of Israelis who would accept it.
Who accept what?
He would accept this type of argument.
That there's no innocent people in Gaza?
No, no, my argument. The idea that you don't want to look like that. But the country is, it's kind of, there is a struggle for the soul of the country. It's true. There is a struggle for the soul of the country. And there is a problem that I would say the more darker sides of our life has been brought to a certain degree to the center of our political life, both in the West Bank and other places. That doesn't mean, that doesn't paint all of Israelis, Israeli soldiers. There's a lot of decency there as well. You know, my son-in-law was fighting in Gaza since this October 7th. These are older people, and their commander, he's from the north, and he lives in Kibbutz Beit Hillel, but his family is evacuated while he's in reserves in Gaza. They are in Hadera. And they had a week off. The unit had a week off in between. What did the unit do in the week off? They went to work in the field of their commander in the kibbutz. That's also Israel. So, and by the way, the appeal of the civic society and its solidarity and the so many good things that were done. Israelis, it's an internal struggle. And those arguments should be made, can be made, and have to be made in our atmosphere. Now you're asking me about religious voices. My experience is there is no one bad deed that you cannot quote a verse to support it.
There's no one bad deed that you can't find a verse to support. That was the statement. Maybe try to speak into the microphone.
Believe me, I can, and we have enough stuff in our tradition. And by the way, talking the language of the weak from a position of power, very lethal combination. And, but there are other voices, serious voices. You know, I grew up among deeply religious people. I had teachers, very serious Talmidei Chachamim, who would never talk this language. Never. Who, you know, who had this idea of the sanctity of human life, who had a concept of Chilul Hashem, very deep. So what you're saying, actually, the struggle is not only about where Israel goes, but where Judaism is going. And it's a very serious struggle. And we have to engage it seriously. Yeah, that's a topic for a whole few days conference, I would say.
If you're looking for a next topic. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, anything
No,
that was said, and also the question directed at you.
Sure, on the genocide question. I mean, I think that Moshe already spoke very powerfully about the ways in which the accusation of genocide against Palestinians, like, is ahistorical and doesn't make any sense. And that has been my kind of baseline since these allegations began, or I mean, honestly, they actually do predate October 7th, but they obviously really took flight post October 7th as the war intensified. I do think that, you know, while the big picture on how Israel has handled the occupation since 1967 or handled all of its relationships with Palestinians since its establishment in 1948 obviously belie any accusation of intentional and systemic destruction of the Palestinian people, because they have become, in fact, more numerous. Many are citizens of Israel itself, etc. This too is it's not a open shut question. It's a living question. So I think there is a very clear defense, and Israel has, you know, this has played out somewhat in the international court this year, that shows that Israel is not intentionally and systemically trying to exterminate the Palestinian people. And there are also legitimate questions about what exactly it is doing from today forward in each battle of the Gaza war, what exactly it has been doing in the various ways in which aid has been disrupted, delayed, blocked to allow for people in Gaza to eat. The ways in which things like, I mean, so there are legitimate questions about the level of destruction, the level of hunger, and the level of killing that has become now day-to-day part and parcel of life there, that given that the stated goals of the war do not seem to be related to the day-to-day activities of the war, it revives questions of, well, if not genocide, then what? I don't think we're at I mean, I think, you know, I think South Africa today put out a new dossier about its case about accusing Israel of genocide. I haven't read it. I don't know whether it actually is surfacing much new material from the original case or not. I will tell you that I live in Montclair, New Jersey. My kids go to the public high school there. They're seniors, both of them. That's hard on me. They're applying to college right now. Anyway, one of them is taking a class called the Holocaust and Genocide Studies from a Jewish teacher who's a Holocaust educator. It is, I think that's the name of it, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. So she called me last week to say that their next project is to go on the website of Genocide Watch and look at all of the cases in which Genocide Watch, which is some kind of a nonprofit, has either declared a genocide or is looking at whether a genocide is present. And the students are meant to make posters about each of these cases, and they're going to put them up around the high school. And I think it's raising the question of, is this a genocide? Is that a genocide? So there's historical ones like the Armenian genocide, there's the Uyghurs, and there are cases on Genocide Watch about both Lebanon and Gaza. And so next week, there are going to be posters at my public high school, raising this question. I think there's plenty to say, as Moshe started, about why it is that this is not a genocide, why we can show that Israel's not, as I said, systematically and intentionally trying to eliminate the Palestinian people, which is the definition of genocide. But I don't think it's helpful or reasonable to ignore the fact that legitimate people are raising this question, and this question needs to be engaged.
Right. So I want to say something about that. I think, well, genocide is the most horrible thing a nation can do. There's nothing worse than genocide in the history of nations. And genocide means an intentional elimination of a people just because of their ethnic, religious, racial identity. Now, Israel is not involved in that.
Right.
By that I mean, from all things that I know, there is no order to any Israeli soldier kill Palestinians because they are Palestinians. By the way, there might be one soldier who did it. But there isn't such a thing.
Well, and we've seen non-soldiers in Hawara.
Yeah, of course. We're talking about a state project, an army project, etc. Clearly, we have our murderers and terrorists, etc. Well, that doesn't mean, so saying that is so, there is something, I would say even demonic in that accusation. There is, because it's not genuine. Now,
Yeah.
okay. Now, that doesn't mean, it's not that the only war crime is genocide. There are many other things. So you can say, yes, not providing humanitarian support to a civilian population is a crime. Actually, it's a strategic stupidity, and it's a moral problem. Now, Israel is providing tons of humanitarian support, but it was an ambivalent thing. One day this, one day that, in this way. It's not a leverage, it's not a tool of war. Nekuda. And if you engage in it, you engage in a criminal activity. One. Second is, destruction of homes is not a goal of war. It's a collateral outcome of urban warfare. By the way, urban warfare is very tough after you go through urban warfare, especially when it involves tunnels, etc., etc. So not every home destroyed. There's a friend of mine, so I have a colleague who said, I see that Israel destroyed a whole street in Dahia. I said, no, it wasn't the aim of the mission. The aim of the mission was a bunker 20 meters down. And for that, in order to get to that, you have a big crater. But there is an intentional destruction of homes not related to that. And it has to do with something like, well, Gaza is not going to look the way it used to look before. That's wrong, that's crime. And we have to say it, struggle with it, face it, and after, can we stop it? There is actually a lot of misbehavior towards prisoners in terms of harming them, killing them, abusing them, etc., etc. There might be, by the way, a too loose of an idea of proportionality when it comes to high-value targets, though it's very hard to weigh it, but still. As the war prolongs, collateral harm is a real problem. I can, by the way, in my cheshbon nefesh, I can point to a lot of problems, structurals, that we have to face. They don't add up to genocide. Some of it, and I'm not seeking for excuses, some of it has to do with the complexities of war. By the way, unfortunately, 25% of Israeli losses are from friendly fire in Gaza. That doesn't mean Israel is targeting its own soldiers, right? I can point seriously to, and I was trying to understand, to real structural wrongs that are happening in the war and that are magnified by problems of disciplining, and as well some backing in high political environment, including some rabbinic so-called backing. And I don't know if I should. I had a lot of. I confess, I had a lot of difficulty coming here to talk about these issues. Because it's very hard to have a nuanced discussion about those issues. And I say that I'm not sure that's the relevant audience, etc. My own clarity and grasp of the problem is not that full. And I say also, sometimes I read, apropos journalism, sometimes I read, for example, the campaign in Lebanon, and I say, they're not describing the war, they're describing something else, as if it's a human rights event. And they begin to count how many homes in this village, in that village, etc. I mean, what the hell are you talking about? Have you been in that village? Do you know their terrain? Do you know that how embedded they are? How this? All this is not to say, by the way, I'm not talking about the forward.
Keep the mic.
No, I'm saying all this is not to say, again, there are structural wrongs, crimes. I can list it, I can say, etc. This will be an honor. Now you would say, well, look at other armies during their war. That's what happens. That's not satisfying, right? You say, it's our kids, it's our, etc. By the way, it's not a big thing. I don't know if the IDF is the most moral army in the world. I'm not sure. But even if it is, it's not a big achievement. Right? We're reading Parashat Noach. Noach ish tzadik tamim haya bedorotav, right? And Rashi has two opinions, says, bedorotav, it's not a big deal to be the most tzaddik in his generation. Though there is another argument, it's interesting as well. So, we have to seriously account for serious wrongs that are done. Again, not for the sake of, I'm saying it in a spirit of an Israeli, committed Israeli. They don't add up to that type of accusation, right? And also there is an overstudying of this event, that event. You know, this bomb went from this angle, that angle, a whole. Well, sometimes bombs go in angles you don't expect them to go. So I would say I'm with you in that respect, Jody. I'm saying there is an attempt of a critique that his aim is not constructive in any serious way. His aim is actually, what I would say, is to prepare the moral ground for the annihilation of Israel. You see it. It's not something you can take it lightly. It's there in the discourse. That doesn't relieve us in any ways from taking serious look at the wrongs we do. Yeah. Which we do.
So,
okay, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, just,
sorry.
Yes, okay. We'll have to finish up in a moment. So if you had a quick response.
That's okay.
Okay. So I see we have some more questions here, but honestly, many of them I believe were addressed in the responses that we just heard. And so I wanted to ask a concluding question. We talked a lot about what's hard and what's hard to talk about, what's hard to look at, what things that don't feel very hopeful. And I wanted to actually ask each of you to conclude with something that gives you hope about this topic, about the future, what we can do, a positive message for everyone to walk away with. Not to take away from all the challenges, but what gives you hope in the midst of it?
Right.
Maybe we'll start with Jody Radorin.
I mean, look, it's funny. I feel like I'm getting asked this question as the last question in every event I do. People are desperate for something hopeful, and I appreciate it. One of I feel like the core kind of principles about journalism is that we actually really, I don't see things as kind of positive or negative. Like, I feel like that idea, that kind of scorekeeping and that reduction of like, events in a complicated world to some kind of, this is good for the Jews, this is bad for the Jews, this is hopeful, this is not. I don't think that's really how the world actually works. So, and it was funny because I want to also just say I was the night before October 7th, I went to an event at one of my synagogues, and it was really interesting workshop around like some poetry and some art, and we were on different tables, and I happened to be sitting with a man who was a Holocaust survivor. He had been a very, I think he was only 82 or something, so he was a very young baby in the Holocaust. And he kept saying, hope is not a strategy. And I thought, like, okay, like hope is not a strategy. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have some hope. I mean, you could still have hope. It doesn't have to be your strategy. So, and I was thinking a little bit about how do we hold on to pieces of hope without turning them into something that they're not. I'm studiously avoiding the actual question. I hope that everyone's getting that. But I'll say, I'm thinking about this and a return to, I think we got into like really interesting areas, but maybe left a little bit of the core focus of the panel about power. I think we should just remember, like, it's a bleak world, it's a dark time, it's challenging, and like, we are also very powerful. We're powerful and comfortable and prosperous. We're sitting in this amazing building that the Jewish Theological Seminary rebuilt a few years ago, and we have all kinds of freedoms to talk openly about our ideas and about these complexities. And I'm reminded of, I don't know if others of you were at the ADL's conference this spring. I hope not too many, because I'm going to steal something that David Wolpe said there, which is Rabbi Wolpe was on this panel, and I think he was also asked at the end of his panel something hopeful, something positive. Rabbi, what can you say? And he said that he'd been thinking about trying to explain to his dead grandfather what had been going on this year. He was, as you probably know, a visiting professor at Harvard. And so he imagined this conversation he would have, and he said, Zadie, the Jews at Harvard, they're very upset because people are not being kind to Israel. And his grandfather, of course, said, there are Jews at Harvard? And Rabbi Wolpe said, yes, there are Jews at Harvard, but they're upset because there's all these people criticizing Israel. And of course, his grandfather said, there's an Israel? Yes. But, so, okay, like that's my just reality check.
Thank you, and Moshe Halbertal.
Well, I think that I see philosophically or humanly, I see the opposition to despair not as hope, but as lack of commitment. I want to talk about commitment, and a worthy commitment, because sometimes I listen to a friend of mine here, and he says, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're doing this, kind of a super ego landing on me. And I said, after a while, I said to him, you know how it sounds to me? You said to me, your child really sucks. And then he would say, but I had still relationship with you, but my son is not going to have any relationship with you. So I said, okay, what do you want me to do? I'm committed to my child. And we're talking about a worthy commitment. And a worthy commitment means Israel is an immensely precious, important cause that is a result of a decision of immense labor of Jews to assume responsibility and power to determine their own political fate. By the way, American Jews, if they denounce Zionism, they're not cosmopolitans. They are American citizens. My grandfather, who's a Holocaust victim, was in a no-state solution position. He wasn't a Polish citizen. An American Jew denouncing Zionism doesn't make him a cosmopolitan. He is an American citizen bearing all the responsibility for what America does. It's a fact. He cannot have the luxury of both being an American citizen, which is a beautiful thing, and declaring himself as a cosmopolitan. No, that doesn't work. That worked in a very bad conditions of my grandfather in his shtetl. And by the way, he wasn't a social critic in the margins of society. He was just very pained, vulnerable person who ended up where he ended. So I want to talk about commitment. And I draw power from the commitment I see among my fellow Israelis and also many Jews or even other people for defending, improving, working for it to survive, flourish, be a better place, and be honest about failures, achievements, and aspirations. And it's not really about hope, it's about what has to be done. That's the way I perceive it. I would say, apropos your comment about Rabbi Wolf's, I would say I will feel completely ashamed confronting my parents or my grandparents and say, well, we gave up now. You, now? That's a shame. So that's the source of my, you might call it hope. I draw from an internal commitment, serious commitment to whom we are and what we want to be.
Thank you. I just want to thank you both so much. We said at the beginning that we would only scratch the surface, but with these two wonderful panelists, I think we got to talk about a lot of things, and thank you so much for your time.